It's 10 o'clock, let's make a start. Welcome everyone to this our 10th meeting of 2013. I'll ask everybody present to make sure they've got their mobile phones or anything else similar switched off. We have apologies from Bob this morning, initially at least, because the Health Committee have an extra meeting this morning to complete a report which he's had to go to, but if they get that done, he'll join us as and when he can. Our first item on the agenda is a decision on taking business in private. To decide whether we take item 7 in private, that will be to consider how we take forward the report on key transport infrastructure projects. The committee agreed to take item 7 in private. Agreed. Thank you very much. And that takes us to our first substantive item, which is the Section 23 report from the Auditor-General on Scotland's key transport infrastructure projects. And welcome to the Auditor-General, to Angela Cullen, Assistant Director from Audit Scotland, Carolyn Smith, Project Manager, and Dick Gill, Portfolio Manager, Performance Audit Group. And I'll hand over to the Auditor-General to introduce the report.
Thank you, Convener. This report assesses the current progress of 5 major transport infrastructure projects. Members may recall earlier similar reports on the management of major projects, and this one is very much in the same mould. Like them, it deals with some important questions about the control of and accountability for major infrastructure investment. Despite the financial limits it has to work within, the Scottish Government has prioritised these 5 projects because of their importance in helping to maintain and grow the economy. It's also keen to have the benefit of the economic stimulus they provide during their construction. Transport Scotland is the Scottish Government agency responsible for delivering the projects. There are 3 roads and 2 railway projects with a combined estimated building cost of £3.8 billion, which are due to come into operation between 2016 and 2019. Members might find the 2-page spread on pages 10 and 11 a helpful summary of our key findings on each project. At the moment, Transport Scotland expects to deliver all 5 projects within their current budgets and to complete 4 of them on time. The exception is the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Project, where Transport Scotland is now taking a phased approach with an estimated completion date for a revised scope of work that's some 2 years later than previously anticipated. Overall, we concluded that Transport Scotland is managing the risks well, but it can't eliminate them completely because of the scale and complexity of the projects and the fact that they're still live. It has good governance in place for 2 of the projects, the Forth Replacement Crossing and the M8 bundle, while arrangements for the other 3 projects are developing well to reflect recent changes to their scope. This is appropriate, but we recommend that Transport Scotland should improve some aspects of its management, monitoring and reporting of these 3 projects as soon as possible. In particular, good information based on clear business cases is crucial to investment decisions on any major project. We found that Transport Scotland has not always kept project business cases up to date, and we've recommended that it should clarify its requirements in this area to help reinforce control and decision-making for future projects. With regard to the Scottish Government's scrutiny of projects, we highlight the important role of the Infrastructure Investment Board, which was established in 2010 to assess and oversee high-value projects. We make recommendations about how the Government may help the Board to develop its future scrutiny of major projects so that that scrutiny is well integrated with major decision points. I'd like to highlight a couple of points about the costs of the projects and how they're reported publicly. Members will know that the Forth Replacement Crossing is the single largest infrastructure project since devolution and will cost up to £1.6 billion to build. Transport Scotland is paying for this from its capital budget. However, to live within the capital budget, it's financing the other 4 differently, using the non-profit distributing model for 2 roads projects and the regulatory asset-based financing model for the 2 railway projects. It's obviously important to understand the full financial consequences of each project, and our report identifies these. In particular, we highlight both spending so far and the estimated forward spending commitment from each of the 5 projects over the next 30 years. The result is a combined estimated budget commitment of £7.5 billion. You can see the details for each project in Exhibit 9 on page 39 of the report. The full estimated financial commitment of all projects except the Forth Replacement Crossing hasn't previously been reported to the Parliament, while reporting of building costs for 3 of the projects, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Road, the M8 Bundle and Borders Railway, has been incomplete or inconsistently presented. We therefore highlight the need for the Scottish Government and Transport Scotland to improve their public reporting on infrastructure projects. Finally, I've made a specific recommendation to the Scottish Government about the content and presentation of the major project information that it presents in its 6 monthly reports to this committee. I've recommended that they consult with you, along with the Finance Committee and the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, to ensure that you get the information you need to carry out your scrutiny role. Convener, my colleagues and I will be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Okay, thanks very much. And I suppose that the key thing which comes out of this report is the disparity between Audit Scotland's figures around the cost of these projects and the publicly reported costs that we've seen previously. So I just wanted to explore a couple of elements of that to be sure that I'm clear about what Audit Scotland are saying. And key messages, number 2, so this is on page 7, the figures are there that you referred to, Auditor General. Combined cost to build £3.8 billion, but the overall cost, the budget commitment over 30 years is £7.5 billion, almost £4 billion more. The difference between these two figures is the cost of the revenue cost over 30 years of paying for those projects which are being delivered by a NPD, a kind of private finance initiative model. Is that where the £4 billion comes from?
That's right. Because of its commitment to keeping up the level of investment at a time when the capital budget is reducing, the Scottish Government has explored other means of financing investment, and that's entirely appropriate. There's no reason not to be using a revenue basis for funding capital investment. It is obviously important, though, to make sure, first of all, that revenue commitment is affordable, because it extends for a very long period, 30 years in these cases, and it's important that that's apparent to the Parliament in decision making and to the public more generally. But that's the reason for the difference we're seeing here. So
you've constructed that figure. I think you calculate that the revenue costs are around £255 million a year over that 30-year period. So that's a long-term financial commitment the government is entering into. Has that ever been reported anywhere publicly or to the Parliament?
The figure's 225 million on our estimate, and it hasn't been pulled together anywhere in a way that's readily accessible to the Parliament or can be scrutinised over time. It's worth saying the government has made a positive move in setting a cap for the amount of the revenue budget that it is prepared to commit to this sort of investment funding of 5% of DEL spending. What we now need to see is how much the commitments that have already been made account for of that cap over the time ahead that these commitments will last, along with other commitments to NPD and other financing models. But
we can't possibly know if those commitments come within the affordability criterion if we don't know what those commitments are.
That's why we're recommending that greater transparency against the cap is now important.
Okay. And I was struck, even looking at page 10 and 11, the summary of costs. By coincidence, the committee has before us today the regular 6-monthly Scottish Government progress report on capital projects, and not surprisingly, these 5 projects all appear in that report. And I was very struck that even setting aside the revenue costs over 30 years and looking just at the construction costs, the completion costs, there is a pretty wide disparity between the figures contained in pages 10 and 11 of the report and the report which the Scottish Government have provided us with today. Two of these projects, Egypt and the Fourth Replacement Crossing, the figure is the same, which to my simple mind is what one would expect, since these are the same projects. But the other 3 projects, the Western Peripheral Route in Aberdeen, your figure is 745 million. The figure in the report is 472. The M8 Bundle, your figure is 588 million. The figure in the report is from the Scottish Government is 415. And the Borders Railway, Your figure is 353 million, and the capital projects report says 294 million. That's £505 million difference between the reported cost we're receiving today from the Scottish Government and today from Audit Scotland in your report, Auditor General. That's £500 million of difference in expenditure on these projects. Can you explain the disparity?
In broad terms, that reflects the other finding that I highlighted in my introductory remarks, that the information that's reported about individual projects in these 6 monthly updates is sometimes not complete, with elements of cost not included in it, and sometimes not consistent in terms of the cost base, for example, that's being used. If you'd like more detail about individual projects, Dick, Gill and Carolyn Smith can give it to you. But again, that's why we've made a recommendation about greater consistency and completeness in the costs that are reported to this committee, and more generally about progress with the projects.
Just to be clear, you're saying that the 6 monthly reports on capital projects that the Public Audit Committee of this Parliament receives are not complete and not consistent?
What we are saying is that there hasn't been a consistent approach to what information is included. So, for example, on the Scottish Borders Railway, £54 million worth of preparatory work and other costs outside the regulatory asset-based funding haven't been included in previous reports. And we think it's important that there should be completeness for all of those projects. And there certainly should be a consistent base for the key stages that are reported to you, and for the treatment of things like inflation, risk allowances, optimism bias and so on. And it seems to us entirely appropriate that the government should consult with you about what it is you require, and then make sure that you're getting it consistently.
Well, maybe I'm naive, but I would have assumed that when a government's reporting on a project, one of which is £1.5 billion worth of expenditure, that there would be a standard methodology for reporting those costs. Are you saying that there is no standard methodology for reporting on costs of major capital projects?
Interestingly, the FRC project is the one which is most complete and consistent and has been over time. And what we're saying is that it would be in everybody's interest to agree now a standard template for reporting, and to make sure that the information is reported to you consistently in line with that in future.
That template currently doesn't exist?
It doesn't at the moment.
Okay, thanks very much. Mary Scanlon.
Okay. Sorry, excuse me. I wonder if I can be very naive and just ask you a question that I need to understand before going any further. What's the difference between NPD and PFI?
I'll ask Dick to give you more detail on that, but broadly the NPD model is based on an agreement over the life of the contract where the costs of construction and some aspects of management are paid back at a fixed basis. Within PFI, there is the potential for the contract to be sold on to other investors over a period, which means that more significant profit can be extracted from it than was foreseen at the original point.
So if you take out the potential to sell on, which is only a potential, are they pretty well the same then?
Dick's our expert in this, and
Okay.
I'll ask you to talk him through that.
I think Caroline has got it quite accurately. The essential feature of NPD projects, which is different from PFI projects, is that the return to the private sector investors is capped as part of the contract. So there's no opportunity for what are sometimes referred to as super profits for the investors in the project.
So when it's a non-profit distributing model?
That's correct.
So are there no profits to be made by anyone in this? If it's non-profit, does that mean there are no profits to be made? Is it only social enterprise and charities that build these projects?
No, there are profits, but they are not distributed, or there is a cap on the level of profits that may be distributed from the NPD, the non-profit distributing company.
Right.
So there will be a...
But there would be a cap on PFI depending on the contract that they entered into.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
There would have to be a cap on PFI depending on the contract that they entered into. No one has limitless profits. Depending on the contract.
The same contract mechanism is not present, or has not been present in PFI contracts as is present in NPD. So
there's no cap on PFI. They can have any profits they want, and under NPD there's a cap on profits. Is that what you're saying?
The profits under a PFI contract are determined by the performance of the company. If it performs well, then the profits are the difference between what it earns from the public sector for providing the service and what it pays to provide that service. And historically, other audit organisations have highlighted the significant profits that can emerge from that arrangement.
So it's the same type of model, except there's a potential to sell on the contract with PFI and there's a cap on profits with NPD. Is that the basic differences? Because that doesn't seem a big difference to me.
It is a similar model. It's a way of, as Caroline has explained, it's a way of finding additional finance to fund or to finance significant investment.
So it's a similar model to PFI?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Okay. Can I just ask, on pages 10 and 11, apart from the fourth replacement crossing, the bottom line, public reporting, what you say, no public reporting of 30-year costs associated with NPD procurement, which is commercially sensitive, da-de-da. It's the same point on each one. And then when I got to page that the convener related to Exhibit 9, you know, it says there's no public reporting of the 30-year costs, and yet when I go to Exhibit 9 on page 39, as the convener highlighted, we've got 225 million over 30 years. I couldn't quite tie in. One is saying there's no public reporting of the costs, and the other saying we've got 225 million to pay every year for 30 years.
The cost of those 4 individual projects are still commercially sensitive because of the point they've reached in the procurement of each of them. And again, it's appropriate for that information to be kept confidential to avoid weakening the government's or Transport Scotland's hand in negotiating with potential bidders in all of that. What we've been able to do is to look at the business cases that are available and the range of costs that are being assumed in there, and to pull those together at portfolio basis to give a portfolio level to give you an indication of what the likely commitment is. And what we're recommending is the government should explore similar options for reporting at a portfolio level, for example, to give an indication of what the future commitments are and how they sit within the cap that it's set itself as a good financial management exercise.
So you're asking the government to report more accurately, and what you're saying is that this is basically what you've worked out that is potentially, in your own words, the likely commitment.
Yes.
So the 225 million over 30 years in this PFI contract for these 4 major building projects, that is just indicative. It is not an actual amount. The truth is that we don't know how much we're paying over 30 years. Actually, is that correct?
That's correct and unavoidable at this point. Until contracts are actually let and finalised, there will be an element of uncertainty about it. I'll ask Dick to give you a bit more detail about that.
I just want to emphasise that we talk about the estimated commitment in the report. They're not our estimates. We've published them, nobody else has. But the estimates are derived from privileged information which we've received as auditors for the individual projects. So we believe that they are robust estimates of the expected cost that will be incurred, assuming that each of the contracts is satisfactorily completed. So I think the first one due to be entered into contract is the M8. I can't remember exactly when that's due to go to contract, I think at the end of this year. So if all goes to plan, the figures that we have used for the 225 million in the report will be an accurate estimate.
So it is possible to have a robust estimate. I mean, it was previously a likely commitment. I mean, I think what we're saying here is 225 million to be paid over 30 years, but the truth is that that could go up. Is it possible it could be less?
Absolutely. At this stage, that's the best estimate that's available, and we've pulled it together to give you an overall picture. But until each contract is let over time, it won't be clear what the
truth is that we don't know. Right. The second problem that I had was the payments over the 30 years was 5.154 million, and billion. Sorry, about 5.154 billion. And then I go back to the summary on page 4. Now, if we take all the projects, I know the fourth replacement crossings coming out of the capital budget, but the others are PFI. So the total cost there is 3.8 billion. So that leaves PFI payments in the longer term, if you take the total of 7.5. If the building costs are 3.8, that leaves another 3.7 in long-term PFI costs. So that's to make up the 7.5 billion. So if that's 3.7, why is it over 5 billion on page 39?
I'll let Dick take you through the figures in detail, if I may.
Thank you.
Yes. The 5 billion on whichever page it is you referred to is the total estimated costs of the revenue commitments for the 4 revenue finance projects. I don't see any inconsistency. That's included within the 7.5 billion that is mentioned on page 4 of the report.
It's also included in the 3.8 billion. Is that right? Some of that.
I think
that's where the disparity lies.
What I'm doing is take on the summary on page 4, I'm taking the capital costs, and the total is 3.798. I'm subtracting that from the total cost of 7.5 billion.
Yes.
And I'm left with 3.7. So I'm maybe oversimplifying this, but I'm saying that's 3.7 for the long-term PFI payments. I may be wrong. And then I go to page 39, Exhibit 9, and instead of 3.7 long-term PFI payments, I find 5 billion, over 5 billion.
Chair, can I just have clarification?
Yes.
No, Ms Scanlon's trying her hardest here to conflate both NPD and PFI, but can she just call it what it is, as opposed to what you'd like to pretend it is?
Oh, said
it's
it's NPD. A form of PFI.
I didn't say it was a form of PFI.
It was a model of PFI.
No, you said it was a model of PFI.
I said it was
it's
a model
NPD,
of
and I think the important thing is that it's called what it is.
Mr. Dornan, I think colleagues' contributions are up to themselves, and I think Mrs. Scanlon has used both terms, so I think that's reasonable. Mr. Gill.
I'm struggling a little bit.
I think I can help to unpick it, Ms Scanlon. The construction cost is 3.8 billion. The 7.5 billion is the total cost of all 5 projects over the 30 years.
Over 30 years, yes.
If you subtract from it the 1.6 billion capital cost of the 4th road crossing, that takes you back to the 5.1, I think. That's the difference between the figures that are there. So the 4th road crossing is being paid for over a short period of time through the government's capital budget. The other 4 are being paid for through a combination of non-profit distributing financing and resource asset base financing through Network Rail. The total cost over the period is 7.5 billion, but the cost of the revenue funding over that period is 5.1 billion.
But would you agree in this type of financing model that we're looking at today that it is right to be concerned about the amount of revenue committed in the long term, because you do say in this report that this can crowd out opportunities for spending at a later date. So given that Mr Dornan I think is keen to get in now, my final question is paragraph 96. Can I just ask you, this paragraph concerned me. The Scottish Government capped investment from revenue sources, but it's not fully clear how well it assessed the affordability of this part of its investment programme. And then you go on to say that the government did not provide information to allow you to test or confirm that the analysis was reliable or how otherwise it had assessed the affordability of the 5 projects. Now, I find it difficult to have confidence in this type of financing model as we move forward when you were not given by the government the information that you needed to assess the affordability of the projects.
I think it's important to start off by saying that there's no fundamental reason not to fund capital investment through revenue financing models. We all do it when we buy a house on a mortgage or buy a car through a car loan. It is important, though, in any case, and particularly at a time of pressure on budgets, to be able to demonstrate that that revenue commitment, which is locked in for a long period, is affordable. The government, I think, made an important step forward in setting its own cap of 5% of the DEL budget for the amount that it would commit through these types of mechanisms. The next step that we haven't yet seen is a full demonstration of how the commitments currently made and those in the pipeline line up against that cap. We know that these 5 projects represent about 14% of the cap in the 2014-15 year, I think. We know there are other commitments that have been made and other projects in the infrastructure investment plan pipeline. And that's why we're recommending that that transparency is the next step in demonstrating affordability and making sure that the investment is sustainable over time.
That's what I'm trying to get at, and I found that very difficult today, because I think from my questioning we don't know if we're at 2% of DEL, 5% or 10%. And I know that the government has made that statement, and I've looked all the way through the report, and there is no way that this report indicates where we are on that 5% DEL allocation.
You're absolutely right, it doesn't. What we demonstrate is that these 5 projects account for 14% of it, and we are therefore recommending that government should be reporting transparently the overall commitment that it has, and therefore the affordability of these projects and future investment decisions to be made.
Okay, thank you. Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Kabira. On page 11 on Egypt, if I can just quote, Transport Scotland did not update or approve an outline business case before requesting ministers to approve the major changes to scope and cost estimates. Can I just ask how ministers were able to come to an informed decision on project changes without that updated, approved outline business case?
Yes, we say in the report, and colleagues will give me the reference in a moment, that Transport Scotland provided information to ministers in presentation and other forms to let them make a decision about the revised approach to EGIP. That is obviously important. We think it's also important, though, that business cases are kept up to date, particularly at key decision points like that. Paragraph 58 gives you a bit more information about that in the report.
But it's your view that the outline business case should have been updated at the same time as those presentations were being made?
We think it's good practice in general terms to keep business cases up to date so that when significant decision points are made, the information is all there in one place to demonstrate affordability, value for money and sustainability.
Okay. On Egypt again, ministers have yet to confirm the revised target date and will do so after they receive the full business case from Transport Scotland. That was due in May 2013, according to the report. Do you know if the government have received that business case yet?
Carolyn, do we know?
We don't know that. We haven't updated since the completion of our fieldwork at the end of April.
Okay. The original announcement, which was made by the Scottish Government on the changes to the reduction in scope and the phasing of Egypt, was made while Parliament was in recess. Do you think that had any impact on the audit and scrutiny of the changes to the project?
I don't think I can comment on the timing of the announcements to Parliament. What we focused on here is the information that was available at the time decisions were made. It's clear that affordability was an important part of the changes to the scope of the project that were put forward, and it's entirely appropriate to review the scope of it in that way. What we have concluded, though, is that it would have been better had the business case been updated to provide in one place a summary of all the factors that were needed to work that through, rather than it being provided to ministers in different ways. It's obviously also important now that the business case is there as a strong foundation for making commitment decisions in taking the revised scope of the project through as phase 1.
Okay, thanks. Mr Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we're in danger of obscuring the fundamental good news of this, that among the biggest capital projects ever done in Scotland are being carried out at this moment. I have considerable experience in my past life of large projects, and as far as I can see here, on the whole, this is a pretty good news story. if you look at Exhibit 1 on page 10, fourth replacement crossing, the comments made, full and accurate public reporting of estimated capital costs. The other projects, there's no reporting of the 30-year costs because it's commercially sensitive information at this point. So, General, I mean, we would not expect at this point to have these 30-year costs laid out in public.
First of all, I think we're very clear in the report that Transport Scotland does have good governance arrangements in place, and that all 5 projects are currently scheduled to be delivered on the current cost estimates, and 4 of them on current time estimates. So agree with you that there is good news in the report. Equally, though, we think that the way in which the costs are reported and the transparency of them does have room for improvement, both at the level of the long-term commitment that we've been talking about and also in relation to the individual projects. As I said earlier, it's entirely appropriate, while the negotiations are still underway, that the costs of individual projects need not be reported, but we have recommended the government could look at doing that, for example, on a portfolio basis. We also identify a number of ways in which the costs of individual projects aren't being reported either completely or consistently between projects, and we think there's room for improvement there.
And I think that's probably fair enough. Looking again at page 15, the scope of the 4 projects changing, you make it clear here that the reasons for changing are clear and reasonable, and I think that's an important thing to note also. I think that there are certain individual issues perhaps which are worth exploring a little bit further. We have in the past talked about some of the quality of reporting and so on that comes out from public areas, and I think this is falls under this heading as well. I think that there are issues here, for example, paragraph 78 on page 34. The government's obviously put a cap of 650 million on this Egypt project, but there's still quite a bit of work to be done on this, and also what will determine the entire scope of this project, as far as I can see, and I'll ask you for a comment on that, is whether this is going to be eligible to add to RAB. Now, do you have any idea when that might happen? Because it's an important element in this.
I'll ask Dick to come back on the question about timing. It's clearly appropriate to examine whether funding rail projects through RAB is the best method, and we have no concern about that. We do think, though, that because of the reduction in the scope of the project from 1.1 billion to 650 million, there are risks now in making sure that the scoping of it is entirely in line with the budget that's available.
We are at a relatively early stage in this.
We are, but there's been planning going on for a long period on the basis of the original 1.1 billion, and it was quite a short time period between the announcement of that project and the subsequent announcement of its reduction in scope. I've just had a note passed to me to indicate that the proposed date for going ahead with RAB for that project is October 2013.
October 2013. Okay. Turning to the difference between NPD and PFI. I mean, clearly one of the big differences with NPD is it's not an open-ended contract where the private investors get frequently inordinate profits out of it. The whole idea is that there is a cap on it. Would it, in your opinion, I'm probably asking you an unfair question here, it's not really possible to compare the two in terms of how it's constructed and what the outcome is financially.
We include in Appendix 2 an outline of the broad approaches to funding for the projects that are used here. We haven't included in that other types of private financing because they're not in play. In any of them, though, there is a trade-off between cost and risk and time. And it's not possible, I think, to make broad assessments about which is better value for money or better in other ways without looking at the specifics of individual projects. There can be good PFI contracts and bad PFI contracts. For most of them, whether it's a PFI deal or an NPD deal, the cost to the public sector is capped over a period, certainly in relation to the construction cost and the associated financing costs there. The big difference is that under traditional PFI models, there is scope for windfall profits or super profits to the investors who make up the investment vehicles, whereas that possibility is removed from the NPD model. Value for money has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, not via the funding mechanism.
On the face of it, I would say it's pretty good for NPD. Thank you, Gabriel.
Mr. Scott.
So tempted, but I'm not going to. Thank you. Can I begin by thanking the Auditor General and her team for providing, I think, a huge amount of clarity on this long-term issue, which I think is, as the convener was saying earlier on, really important. We are the Audit Committee, and we should know about these things. Parliament should know about them, and if I may say so, the taxpayer should know about them. So I'd like to thank you for that work. Can I pick up the point that the convener was driving at in relation to your second key message, where it states the Scottish Government considers this spending, this is the long-term spending, is affordable in the long term, but it has not fully demonstrated the reliability of its analysis in this area. In reflecting that recommendation, that message, what are you recommending government should do to pick up the need for the robustness in this data?
What we would like to see developing is a regular approach to reporting what the cap is, first of all, and how that's calculated over time. The way it's expressed, it will change over time as a percentage of budget, which we only know a maximum of 3 years ahead. And then what the known and likely commitments are against it. So there's already a batch of pre-existing NPD and PFI commitments which count towards it. There are these projects and others under negotiation where we have likely or estimated costs that will firm up over time as contracts are committed. And there's then a pipeline of planned projects which will also, some of them have revenue consequences if that's the way they're funded. Now, it will take time for that reporting to develop, and the estimates will change over time because costs become clearer as contracts are committed. But having made the very important and positive step of setting a cap for affordability assessment, doing the analysis and reporting against it is the next step that we would like to see.
Thank you. And the 14% of the cap that is represented by the 5 projects you have reported on today, if we ask the accountable officer of the Scottish Government for what the complete number is, what is the 100% of that cap, would they be able to tell us? Would they know?
We know what 100% of the cap is by calculating 5% of the DEL budget. What
is it being used, I suppose, is my better question.
Sorry, yes. 16% of the 16% of the cap is accounted for by these projects.
16, yeah.
We don't know how much of the remaining 84% is accounted for by other things.
By other projects. You don't know, or does the government know? Does anyone know?
I think that's a question for government. We can't answer it.
So, so across all the spending that goes on by government in using these various financing models which involve a year-on-year revenue cost to the taxpayer, we simply don't know what that number is at this stage.
In terms of our audit work and the access we have to it, we don't feel the government has fully demonstrated it, and it's certainly not publicly available in ways that the committee can scrutinise and inquire into.
And how would we, I think that's really helpful, how would we deal with the point that Colin Beattie was making that some of this is commercially sensitive? How does the taxpayer understand the taxpayer's long-term commitment year on year to this spending if we get the answer, well, this is commercially sensitive?
That's very much the reason why we've suggested in our recommendation that some of the reporting may need to be on a portfolio basis rather than project by project. We clearly don't want the government to be weakening its hand in negotiating with potential private partners or providers by being very explicit about what it thinks the likely outcome is. But that's not a reason to be aggregating estimated costs on a portfolio basis or some other basis that gives an indication.
So there's a way in that sense to gain the information on behalf of Parliament. Yeah. And the other point I was going to make on this, what is the proper body within government to do this? Is it, as the convener was suggesting earlier on, the investment board? which the Auditor General you mentioned earlier on in evidence as well. And if it is the investment board, why, again, is there so much disparity between the figures that is presented in a later report to us than the ones that you've presented very accurately today?
I think it's a decision for government where that best is. We think the Infrastructure Investment Board has been a good innovation since it was established in 2010, and we've made some recommendations for how it can become more effective in scrutinising and key decision-making points. It wouldn't need to be there. It could be within the Finance Directorate. There are other ways of doing it, but we do think that the principle that this fuller reporting of the long-term commitments should be developing is important.
Yeah, I accept it's for government to decide where it does it, but there's a logic if you set up an infrastructure investment board that it would know what the numbers were and then report on those, wouldn't there be?
I think Dick would like to add to that.
Just to say that it is a very important and influential body, but it is fundamentally an advisory body. We do make the point in the report that its function is to advise decision makers, not to make decisions itself. Yeah. So the question of what we can afford within the Dell budget is very much that's a policy decision.
Yes. So in that sense, we're better to ask the accountable officer, who is the senior civil servant responsible, rather than that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's very helpful. The final question I was going to ask, if I could, Convener, does the Auditor General and does Audit Scotland have a reflection on Transport Scotland as an organisation, given the very detailed assessment you've done? Are they performing as an organisation?
I don't think we've done the work that would let me answer that question, but we do say in the report very clearly that its broad governance arrangements are effective. 2 of the projects here have got very strong governance arrangements in place. The other 3 need to be updated to reflect changes to the projects, and I think you can draw some conclusions from that without it being a blanket assurance about the management of the organisation overall.
So establishing this principle that there's a slight separation, and it is a slight one, between civil servants providing policy advice to ministers on building a new road or building a new railway, as opposed to the practicalities of contract and how it's done, which is the Transport Scotland function, you think has been broadly successful based on the analysis you've done in this case?
That's not the question we were asking in doing the audit work, but it is very clear that planning and managing major investments on this scale requires specialist skills, and we've seen nothing to suggest that the broad approach to that isn't working effectively.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else? Yes, Mr. Coffey.
Sorry. Thanks very much, Convener. I mean, I think in many ways this sounds to me like the clutching at straws version of the Audit Committee. I mean, this is a good report. Everything about the message that the Auditor General has delivered is good, and her wise advice, I think, is welcome. And her advice relates to issues that we... Sorry?
Carry on.
I just thought there was an interruption there from
Not at all.
the Conservative and Liberal members of the committee. I think the report shows quite clearly, and the Auditor General has said so, that all of these projects are expected to come in budget, and 4 of them in time. The one that's not coming in time has been reprofiled and will save the public purse £350 million. If they aren't good messages, Convener, for this committee to reflect on, then I don't know what is. Particularly when you compare the performance of these projects managed by Transport Scotland with some of the spectacular failures that are happening elsewhere. You said yourself, Convener, in your opening remarks that the cost of these projects are £7.5 billion over the 30 years when you take into account the management and costs and so on and so forth. That's nothing like the £12 billion that's just been wasted by the UK in scrapping their NHS IT system down south. So I think we need to get things in a wee bit of perspective around here and give the Scottish Government a wee bit of credit for delivering major capital infrastructure projects on time and within budget. The issue that was raised by a couple of members on the difference between PFI and NPD, and I think the Auditor General hit the nail on the head there when she said that there's no scope for windfall and super profits to go to the constructors and the development partners here. That's the difference. And I think members in the unionist parties should remember that well. I think too there's an issue really about how can we as an audit committee get some additional sight of some of the public funds that are spent on our behalf from our neighbouring Parliament down south. We don't have visibility into that, and the Public Audit Committee doesn't have any visibility into that. Yeah, these are reserved matters for Westminster. So I mean, spectacular failures of the preserve of Westminster but successes or the preserve of this.
Some of the
this government.
sorry, I think some of the committee are a bit puzzled about where this is going, Mr Coffey. We are the Public Audit Committee of the Scottish Parliament, but carry on.
You did say that whatever Mrs Scanlon actually said was her business, so I'm expecting the same courtity.
I was asking
Convener.
questions. You're not asking questions.
Well, I don't remember Mrs Scanlon being interrupted so often as I'm being at the moment. I mean, the spectacular list of failures goes on, but the key messages in returning to the Auditor General's positive report, and they're common messages that we've heard over many years here, Convener, is that we can always improve systems of reporting and accountability. And I think from the press coverage of the issue so far, I think there's a commitment there from the Scottish Government to do just that. And we'll see that in the next report that comes up, Convener, when we're looking in some more detail at the differences between the capital project figures you mentioned yourself. So I think the message in the report is very positive indeed, with the usual and very welcome comments from Audit Scotland to improve systems and processes, and I think that's something that we're happy to embrace and the Scottish Government's happy to embrace and will be for the years to come.
I'm not sure if there was a question there, but Auditor General, do you want to comment?
There's just a point I wanted to clarify, if I may, in relation to the early part of Mr Coffey's remark. We're very clear in the report that Transport Scotland expects the projects to be delivered on budget and 4 of them on time. We think that they're managing the risk to the projects well, but we also say very clearly it's not possible to eliminate all of the risks to them because of their size and complexity and because they are still live projects. We are saying in broad terms the governance of these projects is good, but I do need to place on the record that they will remain risk to their delivery simply because they're large projects which are still in process.
I would expect anything less.
Anyone else? All right, thank you very much to colleagues from Audit Scotland, and we'll take 5 minutes to let the witnesses sit down from the table and take a comfort break. Let's reconvene. The committee's back in session. We now move to item 3 on our agenda, which is the 6-monthly major capital projects update from the Scottish Government. And before I open that up for comment, just to draw colleagues' attention to a paragraph in the covering letter from the Permanent Secretary, where he says, as we are regularly publishing much more information about the progress of major capital projects, I would welcome the committee's views on whether this might mean that reporting arrangements to the committee should be updated. So I think he's suggesting there that he would like to provide less information because information is being published elsewhere, but obviously that's relevant to our previous agenda item as well. So, anybody want to comment? Mr. Scott.
I just think in light of all we have heard before, and you can take both the positive arguments that some of colleagues were making and also the challenging, I think, numbers that are behind that, there must be a decent argument for having that discussion with the Permanent Secretary and having, if we could, having him into the committee in the autumn to discuss the issue around publishing more information, not least of which because of the discrepancy in the figures. We would need to understand as an audit committee the discrepancy in the figures that have been coming forward this morning from the Auditor General on one hand and his own paper on the other hand. I think it would be very welcome to understand that. It would obviously be very helpful for him to clarify the issue the Auditor General was raising around the 5% of DEL budget cap and what these figures mean. He is clearly the accountable officer, and it seems to me the most appropriate person to ask about that. And I also personally would very much welcome his advice on how the hub territory for schools and for other projects work as well, because I simply don't understand, again, what percentage, for example, of the North Hub £700 million spend in one of his annexes, how that relates again to the 5% cap on DEL. So I think that it seems to me, in light of the Auditor General's report this morning that we have discussed previously, there would be very compelling reasons, not least of which on the paragraph you mentioned in his letter, to ask him to come along in the autumn and discuss these matters very fully.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dornan.
I want to comment on the paragraph you did mention and ask that we wrote to him to suggest what we meant by updating. You know, you said, is this going to be less information that we're receiving and probably signposting to where it is or whatever? I mean, I take on board the points that Tavish Scott's made, and I don't know, it may well be worthwhile getting them in, given some of the other concerns as well.
Okay, Mr. Beattie.
Reading that same paragraph, he says he's asked officials to liaise with the committee secretariat and possible options. I don't know what these options might be. Do we have them?
We can ask for advice from the clerks if there's been contact.
We did have an initial discussion with Scottish Government officials several weeks ago who first raised this issue about how this information might be provided, but very much what's set out in the Permanent Secretary's letter is consistent with the discussion that we had with officials. There was an indication that information through the infrastructure investment plan and other documents which the Scottish Government regularly provides could provide this level of information. And beyond that, there'll be no further discussions.
Would they provide that level of information?
Well, I think the Permanent Secretary is suggesting that they would. I think that Audit Scotland this morning have suggested rather the opposite and actually proposed that the content and presentation of the information in this report be improved and list some ways in which it could be improved. So there are contradictory suggestions there which I would suggest it is for the committee to explore what we want. Anyone else? Yes, Mr. Coffey.
What does the Finance Committee get by way of financial reporting on capital programme?
I don't know the answer to that. We can certainly ask them.
I mean, you're always kind of conscious that
I think, sorry, just also, if we were to ask them, we should also ask the Infrastructure Committee, who I suppose are clearly relevant in this context.
I mean, if they're getting better information or other information, I would certainly wouldn't mind being able to see that at this committee, or rather than inventing a new system and a new process just for us. That might help us. But I mean, I'd be happy to hear from any officer about some of the discrepancies in figures here, and I think we're entitled to ask that. I mean, we may as well ask that. We don't need to wait until the autumn. I mean, you mentioned one figure in the report itself that there was a difference of about £270 million there. So I think we need an explanation for that at the outset, and I would prefer not to wait till the autumn for that.
Well, can we, just to make a suggestion, because there's a fair bit of overlap, I think, in everybody's contributions, could I suggest then that we look at asking the Permanent Secretary to come to the committee to discuss some of the issues around the capital projects report, both the committee's and his, because he clearly is looking to change things as well. But given that we're going into recess next week, that in the meantime we write to him and ask about the difference in the figures that are given for the 5 projects here and in the Audit Scotland report, and that would allow us to have some correspondence from him as well to inform that discussion. Would that be a way of taking this forward?
Yes,
we agree that. Mr. Dornan, sorry, you were trying to come in.
I was just going to say, look, we're kind of crawling into item 7 here as well.
We are,
so I think
accept
it's a good
that.
idea to bring it to a close.
I think that's true, but to be honest with you, I think in terms of this capital projects report we get, I think there is a sense that it would be good to have the discussion, and Mr. Housen himself does seem to want to have some discussion about that report. So could we agree that? Yep. But I agree with you, it may be something which overlaps into how we take forward the previous report we've heard when we come to discuss that later. Can we agree that then? So we write to the Permanent Secretary about the discrepancy in the figures, but we also ask him to come before the committee for that discussion to take place.
Agreed.
Agreed? Thank you very much. Next item is the Scottish Government Progress Report. So this is the report that we get, is it once a year? Twice a year? Once a year. Twice a session on issues which we have flagged up to the government, would like to see some progress on. Open this up for members' comments. Could I then, if nobody else wants to comment, make some comments on the progress report on the evaluation of keeping well, which arose out of work we'd done around both cardiology and health inequalities. And in particular, it seemed to me that the ISD submission was quite worrying, in the sense that ISD said that they were involved with the Keeping Well project early on, but had little success in ensuring that complete and consistent data was collected, and then withdrew from the project once it went beyond the pilot, a situation they describe as disappointing. And perhaps even more significantly later on in this report, they draw attention to the difficulty of accessing data from GP systems, and say, if left unresolved, this could potentially undermine the integration of health and social care. I have to say, while this is just a progress report, these seemed quite serious concerns that ISD have. I wondered if it was something we should draw to the attention of the Health Committee, who will be dealing with integration of health and social care. Mr. Beattie.
Problem that we're unable to evaluate Keep Well. I mean, there's a lot of money goes into that, and it's more than just disappointing, as they say, that we're not able to evaluate it. The question is, what do we do?
Yes.
I mean, what is the measurement? How can we measure it? And if we can't measure it, there seems to be a feel-good factor that, yeah, we think it's doing something good. So if it's axed simply because there's no measurement, it could have a negative impact on the people who are currently benefiting from it. It's a no-win situation. But can you justify a public project, and I'm straight a little bit here, but can you actually justify a public project that you can't evaluate?
Thank you. Yes, Ms Mary Scanlon.
I think it's just a constant theme of Colin Beattie's, and I think, to be fair, this committee has been highlighted by the Auditor-General in her letter at the end of this report. And again, I seek your guidance on this, Convener, but you know, if you take the second paragraph, many of my predecessors' reports to the Audit Committee have highlighted gaps in the availability and quality of data. And to be honest, every single report that comes in front of this committee is about the gaps, the availability and the quality of data. And I don't know, I'm just seeking guidance as to how we as a committee can ask, well, who do we call in government to say, after 14 years of a parliament, can we have proper facts, figures, data, comparative data? Because, you know, we've been asking for it for 14 years, and every report that we still get in 2013 still says there's not enough data, the quality of data is not good. I mean, we're a small country with 5 million people. Is there not somebody in the government that can tell us, or, you know, is there not someone within the civil service, within the Scottish Government, that can crack the whip and bring some accuracy to this?
Well,
I don't know.
I suppose we've just agreed to invite the Permanent Secretary to come to the committee, so that might be an opportunity, since it does seem to be a problem that cuts across all departments and portfolios.
Could we include this paper as part of our questioning to the Permanent Secretary?
The committee's agreement, and as long as we indicate to the Permanent Secretary that that's our intention, I think that would be a reasonable thing to do.
That would be helpful.
It's not all gloom and doom. I mean, there is a positive message in page 3 of Derek Feely's report there, saying that the Keep Well impact evaluation is underway, and we will be finding out in the summer of 2014 just what the impact of this particular programme is. So it's not all bad. There is a positive message in there. I think your message about the ISD element of it is something that I think we would be wanting to alert our colleagues in the Health Committee about. And you'll notice Derek Feely's comment there on page 5 that given that we're actually introducing health and social care, ISD's role, it's the second last paragraph, Convener, there, ISD will have a major role in assisting us with that, to monitor that, the process of that there. So I think it's a good opportunity, a good time to alert our colleagues in the Health Committee about our concerns about consistency and quality of data gathering, and how we can improve the contribution that ISD makes for us.
Okay, so two actions I think we're agreeing here. The first is to write to the Health Committee to draw their attention to ISD's concerns with regard particularly to the health and social care integration and the impact that poor data gathering or difficulties in data gathering might have on that. But secondly, to when we invite Sir Peter Housen, that we indicate to him that we'd like to talk about the quality of data gathering across the Scottish Government, as well as the infrastructure projects. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. I think that's helpful. Item 5 on our agenda is a response from the Scottish Government on our report into management of patients on NHS waiting lists. Open this up for comment. Perhaps I could welcome this then. I thought that all of the recommendations we made had, as far as I could see, well, with one exception, had been accepted by the Scottish Government. The one which they didn't accept was around the inclusion of outpatients in the data. But that aside, I thought it was a positive response to the report that we made. Anyone else? Mr. Dornan?
No, I just agree with you. I also, even the way they responded to the outpatients one, about using text and stuff like that, they took everything on board.
Yes, Mary Scanlon.
No, I thought it was quite positive. It addressed the issues that were raised. But I think given that we're looking at an update from the Auditor General in December, I would be content to note this report today and to look at the NHS management of patients on NHS waiting lists in the update report we get at the end of the year.
Okay, so Mary Scanlon is helpfully suggesting we note this report in the knowledge that we do have an update before the end of the year on the issue. Is that agreed? Good, thank you very much. Item 6 is correspondence from the Scottish Government and Scottish Enterprise on the Section 23 report managing early departures from the public sector. Open this up for comment. Mr. Scott, I think this was largely provoked by...
I can't now quite, if I'm being honest, remember quite what initiated it all, but I thought the interesting response in the guidance, the Annex A guidance from the government was that the government do not collect or hold information centrally on the number of this is halfway down the Annex A, the first page, does not essentially hold compromise agreements used across the wider public sector. Now, there may be really good reason for that, but what the paragraph doesn't do is explain why. Now, it could be, as I say, a perfectly good reason and so on and so forth, but I would have thought if this is an issue of some concern, and maybe it's not, but if it's an issue of some concern, then it would have been helpful just to have set out why these figures are not collated. The government's response in relation to central government staff is this is used very infrequently. I accept that. It's very clear from the evidence that's the case. But it clearly was used by Scottish Enterprise, and we don't really know as a committee whether this has been used in a wider sense across the wider Scottish public sector. And I wonder if it would be worth at least exploring with the government, not how many, because they don't know, but what their particular reason is for not for holding or retaining that information. I just simply would like to ask that question.
I'm very relaxed about writing back and asking the question why they take that position if other committee members are agreeable. Yeah, let's do that. Any other comments on this? No, thank you very much. That ends our public business, and the committee will now move into private session.